Lecture 9, Sappho and Pindar.
Welcome back to Lecture 9, in which we're going to turn from epic to talking about a very different kind of Greek poetry, lyric poetry. The term lyric was first used by Alexandrian scholars in the 3rd century BC, and they meant it in a more restricted form than its modern sense. Modern usage of the term lyric tends to mean any relatively short poem in a variety of meters, but the Alexandrian scholars who first coined the term used it to refer only to poems written to be sung to the accompaniment of a lyre, which is what the term lyric literally means. Poetry sung to a lyre would be called lyric. And the Alexandrian scholars of the 3rd century distinguished lyric poetry from other forms of relatively short poetry that were either declaimed rather than sung, for instance, iambic poetry, which is poetry normally of personal invective, of abuse of one's enemies, or elegy, which was written to be sung to the accompaniment of a flute. For the Alexandrians, lyric meant only poems written to be sung to the accompaniment of a lyre. And so when the Alexandrian scholars of the 3rd century drew up a canon of great lyric poets, they included only 9 names of great poets who had written poetry to be sung to a lyre. But in later usage, lyric came to mean any short poem, particularly any short poem that foregrounds the individual voice and individual concerns of the poet, or at least of the persona that the poet puts into the poem. Poetry that talks about individual concerns, individual emotions. Short poetry, that's what came to be meant by lyric. And in this lecture, I'll be using the term lyric to include forms of personal poetry such as iambic and elegy, rather than restricting it to poetry written for the lyre. Now, lyric, in this broader sense, is distinguished from epic in 3 main ways. First of all, its length. Second, its meter. Third, and most importantly, its content. Lyric poems are short. They're often only a very few lines long. At their longest, they're a few hundred lines long. So lyric poetry is short poetry, short and self-contained. And unlike epic, which is, as you'll remember, by definition, was written in dactylic hexameter in one particular meter, lyric was written in a variety of meters. Most importantly, lyric's subject matter is very, very different from the subject matter of epic. Epic poetry sets out, as we talked about in the previous 2 lectures, to memorialize the past and deeds of famous characters in the past. And while the epic poet does sometimes, not very often, but sometimes speak in the first person singular, for instance, the first line of the Odyssey says, "Muse, tell me the story of the man of many turnings." So there the poet is speaking in the first person singular. But the epic poet never interjects his own personal experiences into his poetry. Homer does not say, "I'm sitting here drinking a glass of wine with my good friends in a tavern, and Muse, I would really like you to tell me the story of Odysseus." That's not how epic works. That is how lyric works. Lyric is personal poetry. Lyric poets write about love, friends, enemies, experience of war, but not in the Homeric sense, in a much more personal sense, as we'll see, even an anti-Homeric sense. The scholar David Campbell, talking about Archilochus, the first lyric poet any of whose work has survived and who wrote in the 7th century BC, talking about Archilochus, David Campbell says, quote, "To turn from Homer to Archilochus is to enter a new world. The material of his poetry is his own life, new surroundings, his love for a girl, the death of his brother-in-law, the treachery of a friend," close quote. So very, very different content from epic. Now, lyric came into its own, as far as we can tell, in the 7th through the 5th centuries BC. The reason why lyric flourished at this point has to remain speculative. We don't really know, but there are some fairly broad points of agreement about some of the circumstances. Lyric, short poems composed for performance. These weren't composed to be read privately. They were composed to be performed. Probably existed for many centuries before anyone wrote it down, just as epic did. And so it's perhaps misleading to say that lyric is a later development than epic, though we often do say that. The Homeric poems are written down, then lyric develops. That's a kind of shorthand for saying lyric becomes important, appears prominently in the written scene after Homeric epic is written down. But probably, as in most societies, people were composing short personal songs and singing them to friends all along. It does seem clear, however, that there was an increased production of lyric and a change in the overall focus of lyric starting in the late 7th century BC, about the time Archilochus, whom I just mentioned, was writing. At this time, we find named individual poets becoming prominent, and their poems often seem to set themselves in direct and deliberate opposition to the ethos of Homeric epic. Let me give you an example. This is a short fragment by Archilochus. He says, "My shield's in the hands of some jubilant Thracian, a faultless piece of equipment which I left unwillingly beside a bush. Myself, I'm safe. What do I care about that shield? To hell with it. I'll soon find another one that's no worse." Now just try to imagine Achilles or Hector or Odysseus or Patroclus saying that. The Homeric warrior does not throw his shield aside so that he can run more quickly away from his enemy. You cannot imagine a Homeric warrior fighting for Time and Kleos saying, "The hell with that shield as long as I'm safe." Archilochus is deliberately setting himself in opposition to Homer, or so it seems, in writing this kind of poem. Now, we don't really know the reasons for this change, but in general, the 7th and 6th centuries seem to have been a time when traditional values were reworked in several spheres, including the political sphere, and the individual voice of lyric poetry comes into its own at this same time period. There are two main forms of lyric. Choral lyric, i.e. lyric written to be sung by choruses, written by one poet but performed by a whole chorus, and monodic lyric, or monody, which means one voice lyric, i.e. lyric that is performed by a single singer, a single poet. Now this is a modern distinction. Ancient critics did not distinguish between choral and monodic lyric, and often the same poet would write both forms of lyric, would write both choral lyric and monody. But there are some distinctions that I want to make, and then I want to talk first about Sappho as an important writer of monody, and then finish by talking about Pindar as an important writer of choral lyric. Both forms, choral and monodic lyric, were written for performance, but the circumstances of the performance were probably different. Choral lyric was probably performed at public occasions, weddings, victory celebrations, that sort of thing, while monody was more likely performed for relatively small private audiences. The poet would be more likely to sing a monodic lyric at a private dinner party, at a private gathering of friends, as opposed to a public occasion like a victory celebration for an athletic contest. And there's some distinction of subject matter between the two forms of lyric. Monody tends to be more directly personal. There are also formal differences of meter and of dialect. And as I said, what I want to do at this point is turn to talking about one primary example of each of those forms of lyric: Sappho for monody, Pindar for choral lyric. Sappho is probably, in the modern world, the most famous and in some ways the most interesting lyric poet. She was born on the island of Lesbos around 630 BC, and her collected poems filled 9 books, that is 9 papyrus scrolls, in the edition prepared for the Alexandrian Library. Sappho's reputation in antiquity was higher than that of any other female author, higher than that of many male authors. She was referred to as the 10th muse. The 9 muses are the goddesses of creative activity, of poetry, history, astronomy, and so forth. To call Sappho the 10th muse, then, is extraordinarily high praise. It puts her on a level with these goddesses of creative activity. Unfortunately, we know very, very little about her life. The fragments of her poetry seem to give us a few biographical details. We also have biographical information about her, but it's from much later sources, centuries later, and the details are often contradictory. So we really don't know very much at all about Sappho, beyond that she was born on Lesbos. She was probably married. She apparently had a daughter. You see how I'm qualifying even the little bit that we do know. She may have spent some time in Sicily. Despite the meagerness of our information, speculation about details of Sappho's life has been very, very common from antiquity onwards. Now, in part, this is because of Sappho's gender. female authors were extraordinarily rare in the ancient world. They just almost didn't happen. And so for a female author to have the status that Sappho achieved, to be considered one of the greatest poets who ever lived — she was one of the canon of 9 lyric poets that I mentioned among the Alexandrian scholars — this obviously raised interest and speculation. What kind of woman was she? What details of her biography might explain why she was able to achieve this status when so few women could? The speculation about details of her life has also owed a great deal to the erotic nature of most of her poetry. Now, modern readers tend to assume that Sappho was lesbian in our sense of the term. In fact, our sense of the term comes from Sappho, comes from the fact that she was born on the island of Lesbos. She was referred to as the lesbian poet, originally simply as a geographical designation. The lesbian poet is a poet who comes from Lesbos, just like the Sicilian poet would be a poet who came from Sicily, and so on. But because so much of Sappho's poetry seems, at least to modern sensibilities, to be homoerotic, to be erotic poetry written by a woman about other women, the term lesbian came to mean a woman who is attracted to other women, rather than being a purely geographical designation. But surprisingly, at least surprisingly to us, in antiquity, ancient authors do not seem to have immediately assumed that Sappho was lesbian in the sense of being attracted only to other women. We have references to ancient Greek comedies, ancient comedies from the area around Athens, which refer to Sappho's voracious sexual appetite for men. So she was seen as being sexually voracious and promiscuous, but towards men, not towards other women. We have one almost definitely apocryphal story — it's probably not true, but it shows how she was regarded — that says she committed suicide over a man named Phaon, that she was so madly in love with him that when he rejected her, she jumped off a cliff. Now, her poems undoubtedly praise the beauty of other females and do so in highly eroticized terms, but the problem that we encounter here is how much of this is conventional rather than personal. In other words, assuming that because Sappho writes what we would consider erotic poetry for other women, she must have felt those impulses herself, is not as simple or straightforward a matter as most of us would think it is. For one thing, we have examples of partheneia, that means maiden songs, choral lyrics written for girls' choruses to sing and written by male poets, in which the singers address one another in erotic terms, praise one another's beauty, talk about one another's erotic attraction. Either we have to assume that these choruses of girls for whom these poems were written were all lesbians in our sense of the term, and that the male poets knew it and wrote appropriate songs for these girls, or, and I think this is a more likely alternative, we have to assume that there was a convention in which young women praised the sexual beauty of other young women without the assumption being made that those girls themselves were attracted to one another. So the mere fact that Sappho wrote poetry praising other women's beauty is not in itself evidence for her own sexual orientation in our sense of the term. But it is undeniable that she did write many poems that certainly sound to us as though she's talking about passionate love for another woman. Part of the problem that we have in evaluating the exact tone of Sappho's erotic addresses to other women and the content of the rest of her work as well, and she did write other things as well, part of the problem is that we have so very, very little left of her work. In fact, of her 9 books, her 9 papyrus scrolls of poetry, we have only one complete poem, usually called the Hymn to Aphrodite. This poem survives because it was quoted in its entirety by a later literary critic, a man named Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who found this poem so beautiful, so lovely, that he quoted the entire poem in his essay that he was writing about it. He lived in the 1st century BC, so some 600 years after Sappho's own day. He said that this poem's charm consisted in the elegance and smoothness of its construction, and I think most modern readers would probably agree with him about that. It is also extraordinarily beautiful in its sounds. Sappho was an absolute genius at the use of alliteration, assonance, what we could call sound effects in general. It's part of what makes her very, very difficult to translate. And if you'll listen just to the first 4 lines of the poem in Greek, perhaps you'll get some sense of the sound of it and also of the meter, the metrical pattern, which is, by the way, called the Sapphic strophe, named for her. It's 3 long lines followed by 1 short line. The first 4 lines in Greek read, Poi kilotron atanat aprodita, pai dios do loploke lisomaise, me masaisi me doniaisi damna potnia tumon. I think you can hear the alliteration, the P's, the T's, the assonants, the repeated vowel sounds, something of the musicality of it, even though you don't know what it means. This, as I said, any of Sappho's poetry is very, very difficult to translate. In particular, it's difficult because the sounds and the meter are so much a part of the poem. I have actually myself translated the hymn to Aphrodite into the best approximation of the Sapphic strophe that I can do in English, where we use stress rather than length-based meter. And this is more or less what I came up with. Iridescent throned Aphrodite, deathless child of Zeus, wile weaver, I now implore you, don't, I beg you, lady, with pains and torments crush down my spirit. But before, if ever you've heard my pleadings, then return, as once when you left your father's golden house, you yoked to your shining car your wing-whirring sparrows. Skimming down the paths of the sky's bright ether, on they brought you over the earth's black bosom, swiftly. Then you stood with a sudden brilliance, goddess, before me. Deathless face alight with your smile, you asked me what I suffered, who was my cause of anguish, what would ease the pain of my frantic mind, and why had I called you to my side? And whom should persuasion summon here to soothe the sting of your passion this time? Who is now abusing you, Sappho? Who is treating you cruelly? Now she runs away, but she'll soon pursue you. Gifts she now rejects, soon enough she'll give them. Now she doesn't love you, but soon her heart will burn, though unwilling. Come to me once more, and abate my torment. Take the bitter care from my mind, and give me all I long for. Lady, in all my battles, fight as my comrade. Now, one point I have to make about this translation right away is that the sex of Sappho's beloved is not anything like as clear in the Greek as I had to make it in English. In my translation, I had to repeat the pronoun she several times in the next to last stanza. Now she runs away, but she'll soon pursue you, etc. Because in English, you have to have a pronoun before a verb. You can't just say now runs away, soon pursue. But Greek doesn't use pronouns that way. Greek just uses the verb. And so there is no pronoun in Sappho's Greek to tell us whether this is a he or a she. The sex of the beloved for whom Sappho is beseeching the goddess Aphrodite, the sex of the beloved whom she wants Aphrodite to bring to her, is indicated in only one word, a participle meaning willing, etheloisa, where I've translated soon her heart will burn though unwilling. The Greek actually says kai uk etheloisa, even if not willing. Unfortunately, the text is uncertain at that point. The manuscripts are damaged. The participle may not be etheloisa at all. We aren't really even entirely sure what it does say. So the one word in this one complete poem of Sappho that indicates whether she's talking about a man or a woman is uncertain. I've gone with the she, but I could be wrong. As for the rest of Sappho's work, we have fairly extensive fragments of a few poems and tiny, tiny bits of pieces of others. Let me just take a second to explain what I mean by fragments in this context. There are 2 types of fragments of Sappho, and for that matter of any other ancient Greek or Roman literature. There are literal papyrus fragments, i.e. damaged bits of papyrus scrolls that have been dug up, usually in Egypt. The climate of Egypt is excellent for preserving papyrus, and many important bits of ancient works have been found on garbage dumps of Roman army camps in Egypt and that sort of thing. So there are literal scraps of papyrus where you have however many lines the piece of papyrus happens to be. Sometimes very long, sometimes just a few, sometimes with inconvenient holes right where you would like to know what a phrase was. So those are actual fragments. The other source of what we call fragments are quotations in other authors. I just mentioned that we have the one complete poem because Dionysius of Halicarnassus very kindly, it was nice of him to think of us this way, quoted the whole thing. Other authors will quote just a phrase. And those are very useful, they're very precious. I don't want to sound ungrateful for them, but imagine if we were trying to reconstruct the context of the works of T.S. Eliot, for instance, if we had one author saying, "It was a night that reminded me of Eliot's famous description when the evening is stretched out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table." And then we had another author who said, "As Eliot once put it, I had not known death had undone so many." How much could we reconstruct from just that? Very, very little. And that's the position that we are in with Sappho. One or two word or maybe one phrase quotations for many of her poems. The loss of Sappho's poetry is without question one of the greatest losses of ancient literature. Classicists like to play with one another a variation of the desert island game. You know what I mean by that? What one book would you take with you to a desert island if that was all you could have for the rest of your life? We like to play if you could go back in a time machine and get one text, what would it be? One of the lost texts. And for me, a complete edition of Sappho would be an awfully high contender on that list for what I would bring back that's been lost through time if I possibly could. Well, the second main type of lyric poetry that we have was the choral lyric. Many of the writers of monody also wrote choral lyric, and in fact several of Sappho's poems may have been intended for choral performance. It's hard to tell because of their fragmentary state, but it seems as though Sappho may well have been a writer of choral lyric as well as of monody. And that in itself should remind us of the danger of reading too much biographical information into lyric poetry. This is always a problem in reading any first-person singular poetry. It is so tempting when a poem is written in the first person. I wandered lonely as a cloud. It's very, very tempting to assume that the I, the ego of the poet, of the poem, and the actual living poet correspond pretty directly, and it's very tempting to read first-person poetry as autobiographical, but it's also very, very dangerous. We have no guarantee that the persona of the poem and the actual lived experiences of the poet coincide at all, or certainly no assurance that they coincide precisely. Sappho's poems, what's left of them, strike us as intensely personal, and they read as though they are sincere outpourings of individual emotion. So it's extremely tempting to assume that these poems do indeed reflect actual circumstances of the poet's life, particularly when we know so little about her and want to know so much. So that when she begins a poem with the line, "I have a beautiful daughter," we really want that to be Sappho telling us directly, "I have a beautiful daughter," but it's a fragment. We don't really know who was speaking those lines. And if some of Sappho's poems were written to be performed by choruses, then we really do have to bear in mind the possibility that what strikes us as intensely felt personal emotion or as details of personal biography could be conventional, could be stereotyped, could be something that in her own culture would have been recognized as a conventional expression of emotion written to be sung by a chorus rather than a genuine expression of personal emotion. This is, of course, something to bear in mind in reading any poetry. I'll come back to this in my later lecture on Roman lyric when I talk about the poet Catullus in particular. So, choral lyrics were written to be performed by choruses who sang the poetry and danced as they sang the poetry at various types of public gatherings. Types of choral lyric that we know about included dithyrambs. Those were songs written in honor of the god Dionysus, wedding songs, dirges, hymns to various different gods. And how would we read the hymn to Aphrodite differently if it was to be sung by a chorus and not by an individual? Now there, I do think that it was written to be individual lyric because Sappho uses her own name in it. She has Aphrodite say, "Who is tormenting you, Sappho?" But there are hymns to gods that were written to be sung by choruses. And perhaps the most important, certainly the best preserved category of choral lyric is the victory ode. Poems that were commissioned by athletes or their families to commemorate an athlete's victory in a particular competition, or sometimes to commemorate the victory of an owner, say, of a racing team of horses, rather than the man who drove the horses, the man who owned the horses would be considered the victor. Among the writers of victory odes, Pindar takes pride of place. Pindar wrote epinikeia, that's a Greek word meaning victory odes, usually anglicized as epinetians, and we are fortunate in having the victory odes that Pindar wrote so we can speak in more detail about them than we can about many other ancient forms of lyric. Pindar was born in Thebes, probably in 518 BC, and died probably at the age of 80 in 438 BC. Tradition tells us that he went to Athens as a young man to study music. He received his first commission to write a victory ode at the age of 20. His last datable poem, datable by events referred to in the poem, was written in 446, so just 8 years before he died. That gives him an extremely long working life. And during that working life, he wrote odes for victors from Aegina, Corinth, Rhodes, and Athens, among other places. In or after 476, he moved to the island of Sicily, where he spent time in the courts of the tyrants or kings Theron of Acragas and Hieron of Gela and Syracuse. So he wrote victory odes for people from various different cities. He himself was a Theban. His victory odes, his epinetians, survive in 4 books, which are arranged according to the particular athletic festival for which the odes were written. There were 4 religious festivals that included athletic contests. The most famous to us, obviously, is the Olympic Games, but there were also the Nemean Games, the Pythian Games, and the Isthmian Games. And Pindar wrote victory odes for victors in all 4 of these religious festivals. Now, he wrote other forms of poetry as well, including hymns, dithyrambs, processional songs, other kinds of choral lyric. Those are all lost. We have his epinetians, his victory odes. We don't have the rest of his work. A Pindaric ode, one of Pindar's epinetians, usually contains 3 distinct elements interspersed and intertwined with one another. The first element will be information about the victor and his victory. The ode will tell us the victor's name, tell us the city he's from, mention his ancestors if they're illustrious in any way, talk about his background a bit, his father's name, the name of his city, so on. It will then commemorate the victor's victory in this particular contest. And if he has won other victories in previous contests, it will mention those as well. And it will comment on his prowess, on what a great athlete he is, what a great victor he is. So the first element in a typical Pindaric ode is praise of the victor himself. Secondly, an ode will contain mythological material. Pindar will cite heroes of Greek myth as antecedents for or exemplars for the victor whom he's directly praising. The ode may mention hero stories that are in some way similar to the victor's own story. Your victory here reminds me of Heracles' great triumph over, that kind of thing. Or Pindar may mention a hero who is associated directly with the victor's city, who is considered a founder of that city or an ancestor of the victor's family. Now, the prominence of each of these elements varies from ode to ode, and I by no means mean that Pindar goes through them in order. He doesn't. He intersperses them. The prominence of each element varies from ode to ode, but usually all 3 are present to one degree or another. And I'd like to illustrate that by reading you Andrew Miller's translation of the first few lines of Olympian 2, the victory ode that we call Olympian 2, to give you an idea of Pindar's use of these 3 elements. So this is how Olympian 2 begins. O songs that rule the lyre, what god, what hero, and what man are we to celebrate? In truth, Pisa belongs to Zeus, and Heracles established the Olympian festival as the first fruits of war, but it is Theron, victor in the 4-horse chariot race, who must with loud voice be proclaimed, just in his reverence for strangers, bulwark of Acragas, his city's savior, flower of an illustrious line, men who, steeling their hearts to labor, won sacred soil to be their home beside the river, and proved themselves the eye of Sicily. Unfolding in its destined form, life brought both wealth and glory to crown their native virtues. O Cronian child of Rhea, you who guard Olympus' seat, the summit of all games, and Alpheus crossing, cheered by song, preserve with gracious spirit their ancestral land for their posterity. Once deeds are done, for good or ill, just or unjust, not even time, the Father of all things, has power to undo the end. Those last few lines show you the third element that Pindar often includes in an ode, a proverb, a maxim, a pithy saying, something, a kind of traditional saying about human life. And you can see in these few lines the interaction of all the elements I was talking about. The individual glory and victory of Theron, mythic exemplars, Heracles established the Olympian festival, Zeus founded Pisa, meditations on the nature of human existence. Not even time can change happenings once they have happened. This interweaving of these different elements is very, very typical of the way a Pindaric ode works. So in this lecture, we've looked briefly at the development of choral lyric in Greece and its relationship to and difference from epic. In the next lecture, we'll move on to the 5th century in Athens, the golden age, so-called, of Greek culture, and talk about one of Greece's most important contributions to world literature, the genre of tragedy.